Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Matthew Bay. I am a senior analyst here at RANE, and with me is Ali Plinski. Sorry, it's always hard to pronounce those names. She's one of our cyber analysts, and we're going to talk about China's cyber activities and what we've been seeing them. So, Ali, just to start off with that, what would you, if I just asked you to summarize in like say a minute, what do you see from China these days when it comes from their cyber attacks and cyber strategy?
While China's long term strategy in its cyber foreign policy has historically, and for the most part, continues to be espionage driven, we don't see the same level of disruptive or financially motivated attacks emanating from China in the same way that we see that kind of behavior from countries like Russia or North Korea. That behavior has largely continued. I would say some of the anomalies that we've seen recently from that behavior, perhaps most specifically, has been Nancy Pelosi's recent visit to Taiwan, which leading up to that visit and during that visit, there were a number of disruptive denial of service attacks launched against Taiwanese websites, as well as some local companies and international companies such as 7-Eleven, where a lot of the televisions were hacked to display some anti-US rhetoric, which was definitely a shift, and many attribute it, of course, to China's displeasure with the US taking such a formal diplomatic measure in reference to Taiwan.
Yeah, one of the things I know that we've also seen, I guess, more recently, maybe a couple of years ago in the United States, was there were a few accusations that China had started to be doing some campaigns around information where they were trying to get Chinese Americans to view certain issues for certain ways, calling them out to come protest against U.S. government policies. So clearly, I think we're in agreement that China's cyber strategy is evolving. I guess you would say it's while 95%, and don't quote me on the figure, of course, is still intelligence, intelligence theft or stealing of corporate information, corporate data, things like that. It is starting to become more prominent in other areas. And I think the example that you point to of the recent hacks and attacks that we've seen in Taiwan are an early indicator of what we might be seeing more frequently in the future. Um, Moving forward, would you agree that Taiwan and India are probably going to be the areas where China is going to be more aggressive, just given they're closer to home, more significant of importance to China than, say, doing the same kind of attacks in Europe, for example?
Absolutely. I think that that's accurate. I think we've seen plenty of examples of China having a strong impetus to centralize some of its power in the Southeast Asian region. We've also seen a lot of land and border disputes between China and India over the years in certain regions along their shared border, such as Kashmir. I know that in a week, the heads of state for both China and India will be meeting in Uzbekistan in somewhat of an attempt to sort of diffuse some of those tensions. But from what I've seen, these tensions will likely continue and could be that sort of festering point of tension that could result in further clashes in the future, which I think we also may see a drive of potentially disruptive attacks targeting Indian cyberspace or again Taiwanese cyberspace, depending on what changes occur in both of those countries and their approach towards foreign policy or bilateral relations with China.
Yeah, and I know in the previous escalation of fighting in the contested region between China and India, we did see, for example, accusations by, at least initially, by Indian government officials that a power outage in Mumbai was the work of a foreign cyber actor or really linked to China. I think the investigation that the Indian government came out and didn't really come to that degree of the conclusion. But it does, note that if you are China, you have every incentive and every interest to, gain access to critical infrastructure, even if the intent there isn't to disrupt it. And it's possible, hypothetically, in some of these cases, that we may actually have an incident where China is trying to, note or monitor or gain intelligence about the structure of a network without the intent at the time to be, an attack, but the cyber defense and the cyber and the protocols once an attacker is found out, that could be something that then leads to an accident that shuts down a power plant or a part of the cyber incident response plans, those kinds of things. So those risks can still happen even if the intent isn't there behind China. when it comes to some of these cyber activities.
Right, and I know that China recently has increased a lot of its diplomatic relations with Pakistan, which of course then raises the tensions that have already existed between India and Pakistan for a while. I know that that's also a concern with the expansion of Huawei technology and 5G more broadly. I know that recently China reached a tech communications deal with the Solomon Islands to put in a lot of that infrastructure, and of course the Western concern is always that that infrastructure might later be used for espionage and then maybe eventually some kind of shutdown if a certain country decides to take a diplomatic step that China doesn't like.
Yeah, there's
Um,
actually an example of Huawei equipment being used. I think it was the African Union building in Addis Ababa, where there were some data that was being transferred to servers back in China, and that was not really a spoken gun. I mean, it's not clear that Huawei was, complicit in that. It could have been, a Chinese attacker just using Huawei's equipment or whatnot. But I think what it is from like, the United States and Taiwan and in India's cases, their opinion is like it's just even if China's not doing it right now, one, they might be able to in the future, and two, it's just not worth the risk if you have alternatives. So I think that's the argument, and it makes sense in this heavily, hyper competitive world now that we're evolving towards between the U.S. and China. But going back to Taiwan, which I think is a salient issue, I know we've been asked a lot by clients whether or not China is going to invade Taiwan, whether or not there's going to be a military escalation, and all of that. One of the things that we have constantly been telling our clients is that there's a war is not likely, but some forms of economic and or military coercion is likely to increase moving forward from China against the Taiwanese against Taiwan, in a way that's probably very reminiscent to what we've seen Russia doing in Ukraine prior to the Ukraine invasion and also prior to the 2014 seizure of Crimea, annexation of Crimea. What are some of these types of cyber risks in that gray scenario where it's not war, but China is actually trying to do more coercive attacks? What does that exactly look like in the context of Taiwan?
Well, it's hard to tell entirely how that might play out in the future. I think some economic tools outside of cyber would, Taiwan's so reliant on overseas imports and exports and overall trade agreements with China. Those would probably be the economic tools. In terms of more cyber coercion, I think we would see specifically more disruptive attacks that aim to prevent Taiwanese economic daily activity and result in overall losses or disruptions to certain sectors being able to operate. Such attacks may include data encryption efforts where these companies can't access the data that they need, distributed denial of service attacks where customers can't access those online websites or certain financial services that they may need. This could extend potentially to public infrastructure, which are, for instance, some of the hacktivist attacks that we've seen in Europe against countries like Lithuania. Montenegro has been a recent target, Estonia. All of these distributed denial of service attacks aimed at really disrupting daily life in those countries. While those attacks were more, again, politically motivated in support of Russia and attacking those countries for their economic support of Ukraine, I think we could see sort of those same attacks targeting Taiwanese companies or industries. Again, the same thing goes for data wiper attacks, where these cyber campaigns are really aiming to interfere as much as possible with daily life.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
that's one thing that I think is also just worth bearing in mind is that while the intent and a lot of this geared at Taiwan and Taiwan's own push for independence, a lot of it's going to also catch foreign companies, including the U.S. companies, in the crosshairs. Not only because they're just U.S. companies, and also because the United States is the one, in some cases, that is triggering the incident, like Pelosi's visit, but also because you have things like third-party risk. If you're a government contractor that's working for a Taiwanese government office, you are going to have a technology relationship with that entity, and that's going to then transfer risk of like if a data wiper becomes a little bit more going out. So we did have a question here. Does that mean that there is a shift to active physical agents in Taiwan? Um, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by this question in terms of whether or not you mean, do we expect there to be a shift towards, physical violence in Taiwan, the same way that we see in Crimea, where there would be like little green Russian men running around, or do we see, a a more active case where they're trying to disrupt and actually do, I guess, destructive as opposed to disruptive attacks. I don't think we necessarily, at least in the short of war scenario, would anticipate China trying to destroy infrastructure in Taiwan. It would be more, I think, of a wiper attack that is, aimed at increasing economic costs and fixing systems and a deterrent effect, as opposed to physical disruptions, physical destructions.
Right, because at the end of the day, the cyber realm continues to be an excellent realm of foreign policy where countries can engage in certain actions but avoid overt attribution and therefore retaliation. And so going forward, China will likely, unless it decides to fully commit to an invasion of Taiwan, it will likely continue to try to remain below that threshold of international sanctions, sanctions from the West, because the incident in Ukraine has certainly given China, more understanding of what might happen if they go ahead with this invasion of Taiwan. And until they maybe decide that they've reached that threshold of invasion, they'll likely try to avoid destructive attacks that could be met with international sanctions or economic tools against China.
Yeah, and disruptive sanctions disruptive cyber attacks at least give, well, very flimsy in many cases, a layer of plausible deniability. But the kinds of sanctions that the U.S. would respond with that, if you just look at the Russia example, is typically going to be sanctions that are targeting the companies, entities, and/or individuals or government offices that are involved in the attack, not sectoral sanctions that are targeting, say, hypothetically, the entire tech sector or the entire exports of industrial goods from China. Whereas if we get to a conflict scenario, those things are more realistic. Now, speaking broadly, stepping back from there, do you think that we will see any kind of a higher risk of actual disruptive or higher attacks from China that are targeting the mainland United States? What do you envision there?
Well, it's funny that you brought that up, Matthew, because I was going to bring up the recent accusation that the Chinese government made against the US for
Mhm.
its ongoing cyber attacks against Chinese cyberspace, which it claimed were tens of thousands of attacks that were aimed at stealing intellectual property and targeting universities. And this, while most countries and I would say analysts are aware that countries are stealing intellectual property from one another, engaging in these covert cyber operations, it's very uncommon to see these public sort of call outs. And so I was wondering what you thought about that change in the Chinese approach to the US and what you might think that means for the future of US Chinese relations.
Yeah, I think on that point, it's an important one that China is, in many ways, it's trying to figure out, or at least show that it is, and figure out how it wants to display that it is an equal to the United States. When this is, not just a cyber issue, but rather when you talk about economic power, political power, etc. If China is going to be a global power, and a superpower, it needs to say that it can, match the United States toe to toe. So when China is coming out with political statements, that are highlighting what the U.S. is also at the same time criticizing that the Chinese are doing, it puts them on a level of parity. So if the U.S. is going to name and shame Chinese actors whenever they carry out a cyber attack, and when we say thousands of cyber attacks, depending on how you define that can be one spam email one
Right.
phishing email is an attack. But the point being, though, is that China, by making criticisms about that kind of activity the U.S. is doing, we have to know that the U.S. is, doing all kinds of intelligence gathering operations using all kinds of different methods and techniques, cyber being one of them. China is going to come out increasingly and starting to shed light on more of these activities as they find them, because it then, gives an era of equivalence to what China is doing against Western companies. It makes it, I guess, acceptable. The U.S. has always argued that legitimate forms of intelligence, cyber espionage, is when it's political intelligence or things like that, not when
Mhm.
it's commercial intelligence or commercial trade secrets. China views those two as one and of the same. So by actually making an argument that the United States is also doing that, it again is saying that the U.S. is doing the same thing, so can I. So it's that kind of rhetorical argument that I think probably some truth to it. To be honest, the U.S. has been normalizing a lot of behavior when it comes to some stuff in cyber activity, so I think
Right.
that's something. But as we move forward, just broadly speaking in the cyber domain, the West and the U.S. and Russia, for that matter, and China, um, we are still kind of in this period of establishing what is acceptable and not acceptable for governments to do in cyberspace. And right now, all the countries are normalizing through action because international negotiations have, in some cases, reached agreements, but those agreements are just on paper, not actually actions or enforced at this point.
Right. And to your question about whether China may begin to engage in more disruptive attacks against the US mainland, personally, I don't see that occurring unless there was a major shift in US foreign policy approaches to either China or to Taiwan. Of course, with the impending 2022 midterm elections, I think we'll see disinformation campaigns targeting social media platforms that US citizens use, both by China, Russia, and also Iran. And so, we'll definitely see those kinds of information campaigns by China, but I think the likelihood for really disruptive attacks emanating from China targeting either US businesses or critical infrastructure will continue to be unlikely unless there's a major shift or incident that occurs. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that I would agree. I think when you look at the difference between China and Russia, is that structurally China, at least from our view, has more control over most of its actors in a way that Russia really doesn't over some of the financially motivated hackers. So to me, when you look at the more disruptive attacks that we've seen in the United States and a lot of the ransomware pandemic type things, the shutdown of the colonial pipeline, the more, I guess, aggressive or I guess impactful attacks, with the exception of like SolarWinds, which I'm not downplaying at all. It's a massive hack, but the more
Right.
disruptive to like physical infrastructure, the colonial pipeline hack, that was done by a non-state actor. I mean, there's probably links and murky links to the Kremlin, but there was a layer of separation there that I don't think exists right now in China. And I think if we're ever going to get to a situation where Chinese threat actors are threatening the United States and causing disruption with through financially motivated attacks that are ransomware attacks that are targeting critical infrastructure, blah blah blah. You likely need to see that control element. I know we've talked about this, Ali, together. We need to see that control break down, and I don't think China, given what its own domestic concerns about cyberspace, would ever really want it to get to that place. It might actually look at cooperating with the international community around trying to curb that from happening because it's a major liability for them internally if we ever get to that point.
Well, so you mentioned domestic control over threat actors, and I wanted to bring up the two major hacks that happened this summer that targeted Chinese citizen data, one of which was supposedly taken from a Shanghai police database that compromised over 1 billion Chinese citizens' data, and the other of which was taken from a COVID-19 tracking app that compromised, I think it was around 48 million Chinese citizens. So, what do you think might have driven or permitted these two major hacks? And do you think we'll see more Chinese threat actors either capable or able to do so without attribution, um, be able to conduct either financially motivated attacks against Chinese citizens or otherwise just data theft and leak operations?
I mean, I think one of them wasn't it more something to the degree I'm trying to remember the example, the details. It was something to the degree where some of the information was like actually just posted on social media, and then they were just able to then get in through that. I believe there was some link that was like that. So these aren't real. So my point being, though, these don't look to be very sophisticated,
Hmm.
which also just shows that there are even still a lot of Chinese companies and Chinese government institutions, lack cybersecurity controls domestically if you can get through the firewall. So I think it is a risk that they're well aware of. But I do think it's something that China is going to have to be figuring out as its society is becoming more online, as there is more domestic interest in doing this, as the economy starts to slow down. People are going to go to the illicit activity, things like that. So I think it's a risk that
Hmm.
they're going to be increasing or going to see more data leaks in China. We're going to see more financially motivated attacks, I think, from coming from Chinese threat actors. The question, of course, is how effective can law enforcement in China be at actually containing that threat and making it more like we see in the United States, where there are cyber criminals and financial crime happening here, but they're not the backbone of like the ransomware attacks that we're seeing against against Western organizations. Um, yeah. Oh, we have another question here talking about well, what is Australia's experience with Chinese cyber hostilities? So, do you want to take that one, or should I, Ali?
Um, I'm not fully. I don't have a deep knowledge of
Yeah,
Chinese Australian relations. If you want to speak to it.
yeah. So, this was mainly under the predecessing Australian criticizing the Australian administration. But we did see Australia taking a number of moves to back the U.S. against China, and that resulted in a trade war and on top of a number of attacks on, I believe, the parliament, as well as other, I believe, the ruling or the opposition party. We did see a pretty wide array of, I guess you would call them cyber coercive attacks against government institutions and government political parties in Australia by Chinese threat actors. That is clearly something that is another thing that we're flagging as one of those early cases of them becoming a lot more coercive in its cyber activities. Um, we anticipate this kind of activity to continue to expand. We pointed to India and it's point of India and Taiwan as being probably the areas where China is going to be the most aggressive in the types of risks it is willing to take in doing these kinds of coercive activities. But you
Mhm.
look all throughout Southeast Asia, I think, and also in Australia, of course, I think it's going to become a more common feature of China's, so-called wolf warrior diplomacy moving forward. So this is probably just the start of that trend. Australia, I think, is that leading example, but we're going to be seeing it, as governments in the region, whether they are West leaning or not West leaning, take policy decisions that are not consistent with what Beijing would want, whether that is in Singapore or a South Korea or an Australia or New Zealand or whomever. But I think it's going to become more common.
Well, also this past week, we saw the distributed denial of service campaign against Japan. And while that attack was sort of originated to KillNet, which is a Chinese hacktivist group, it did correspond with Russian Chinese joint military drills that were occurring in the disputed Kuril Islands. And so, the extent to which China may have tacitly uh, also contributed to that distributed denial of service attack, it's difficult to say, but as China and Russia also develop this developing military relationship in the Southeast Asia region, we might also see increased cyber coercive attacks emanating from both Russia or China.
Yep. With that, I think that's all the time that we have for. Please learn more about, go to ranenetwork.com to learn more about what we can do, what our services are, and get more analysis from myself and Ali. Thanks for joining us.